Hello and welcome to News Club. This is where we talk about the news and what to do about it. Joining me today are Debs, Chivers and V, and we will be going a bit more into the BBC Charter Review, the future of the BBC, which, I mean, who knows what's happening there. And we'll also then be talking more on the disability cuts that we're seeing. Just a post-production comment to say that though our conversation did start with the BBC Charter Review and the future of the BBC and then ended with talking about disability cuts, this podcast, you'll find the conversation is actually switched around. Just know that, we decided to change the order of the sections of the podcast. Anyways, Debs, tell us, what is happening? What's been going on?
A million things happening, but the thing I wanted to talk about today, it's another really cheery topic, is the proposed cuts to welfare benefits that were announced in March in the Spring Statement, and there's going to be a vote sometime next month. So I wanted to talk about what those cuts are, particularly ones to disability benefits, and also some of the actions that people can take if they think these cuts are fucking dumb and horrible and will have really just punishing a set of people for the mistakes of the rich. There were lots of things announced in the statement, but the particular thing we're going to talk about is changes to the way that personal independence payments are being assessed for people with disabilities. So personal independence payments are basically money that is given to people with disabilities so that they can live the kind of life that they might live if they didn't have those disabilities. So nobody is getting rich off PIP. PIP is to pay for things like daily care. It's to pay for like a car, it may be a specially adapted car so that you can get around. It's just, the average cost to a disabled person, extra cost is like £1,000 a month. And that might be to do with, extra transport costs, or, you might need to eat particular foods for your health. These things can be extremely expensive. And the thing the government have said is that they're going to try and save £5 billion by restricting PIP. And they're going to do that by changing the criteria. So you need to be even more disabled in order to qualify for this thing. And there have been a few things that have been in the kind of independent or alternative news, or people that actually give a shit about this, which is not the mainstream news, around some freedom of information requests, which have shown that this is going to likely affect over 1 million people, that the majority of those will be over 50. And there was also a report that got released under an FOI, a freedom of information request, in the last week, which is a report from 2022 that the government refused to publish. And it's called Triggers to Claiming Personal Independence Payment. So it's basically some research they did about how it is that people end up claiming PIP. And clearly what they were trying to find was that there's like some scamming going on, that people are going like, I heard from my mate that there's like this way that you can get more money for your life. But actually what this research found is the main reasons that people started to claim PIP is because the cost of living was going up, so life was becoming more expensive and they were less able to afford their lives. And also their health was getting worse. So then they were like, well, I'm more sick and I have more needs and this thing is more expensive. So maybe I'll see if claiming PIP is something that works for me. So completely the opposite of the story that they wanted to tell, which is that it's about scamming. And instead it's about people having genuine needs that they have come to the state for. And you would expect people's health to be getting worse because, one thing, we had a global pandemic and there's loads of people with long COVID and there's loads of people whose other health, and also our health system is completely crumbling and loads of people are on really long waiting lists waiting for healthcare. So of course, the general health of the population has got worse. So some people are going to be needing to claim PIP for it. And I guess these things are trying to tell a different story from the one that is being told in the mainstream press, which is the story that has been told, certainly since like the Blair era, about people conducting benefit fraud who are just trying to like laze about and say that they've gone off sick when actually they're perfectly capable of working and they're screwing you over. And I think there is a kind of a much longer story that you could tell about this, which goes back to like the very beginnings of what sort of became the welfare state. Like under Elizabeth I, you had the poor laws and the first systems of like handing out a few alms to what were known as the deserving poor. But simultaneously with this thing of like, oh, you could get a few alms if we think that you are deserving of this, you had this system for the undeserving poor, which was the workhouse. And so obviously certain kinds of disabilities would put you in this category of the deserving poor, unable to work, not responsible for your own misery or conditions. And I think it's really interesting to go back to that like distinction of the deserving and the undeserving poor and the role of disability in that, because that predates the Industrial Revolution. This is not, this is before the kind of mass movement of people into the cities, before the development of like what we know as the industrial working class. But this division between the deserving and the undeserving poor, you can see how useful it would be as a political strategy, because it just creates resentment. Because if you are considered undeserving, now you have to go into the workhouse. Whereas if you're considered disabled enough to be deserving, you don't have to go to the workhouse. And what a great way to kind of divide people whose interests are fundamentally much more similar than they are to like the overlords who've got all the money in the first place.
Can I just be a tad of a history geek and say, is that in the era then just after the Church of England is formed and they take away all the monasteries, which would have just provided for everyone? They'd have provided alms for everyone. So that was the system of looking after the poor before. And then essentially the sort of state takes control of the church, gets rid of all the monasteries, and then goes, also, we don't want to have to look after all the poor. So we're going to come up with this term. Because I'd never heard that before, but I know that era a little. And that just, it kind of makes sense. But it's also what people talk about, the Protestant work ethic, isn't it? How like Protestants fetishize working and like how that's a moral good and it makes you godly, and people who don't work are not godly, and you see that very much in America and the American culture because it's a very Protestant country.
Yeah, definitely. And like this system devised under Elizabeth I was always, the church was sitting alongside it, and the church was all meant to be doing things for the wider population as well. But yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to think about these things, which kind of the cultural conditions, the things that existed before the kind of capitalism that we have now, and how disability, like when you look at disability, you can really trace these things of like, is disability being seen as, just a misfortune that happens, or is it being seen as a kind of punishment from God? Is it being seen as a kind of excuse to get out of the backbreaking work that other people being forced to do? Yeah, and it's like, and obviously ultimately there was no need for the workhouse. The workhouse was a form of punishment that was being put in place by elites. And yeah, how you bring together people whose conditions are some people are being forced to do, and also that these are really violent systems. So they're systems which literally produce disability. Like once the factory system really takes off, you've got like kids who are working in the mills who are losing limbs, who are like, people are going down the mines, people, like the system of capitalism that is created is also one which like actively destroys people's health, gives people long-term disabilities. And so yeah, I just think that there's something really important when we're looking at kind of stories of benefit scammers now, or the way that people with disabilities are being demonized, being like, but this has been a tool of dividing people and stopping people from being able to come together and challenge the overall cruelty that everyone is being subjected to. This thing has existed since before capitalism existed. So I guess like coming on to like what we could do about it. Well, because right now we are coming up to a vote in Parliament, there is a value in doing some like old school campaigning, like writing to your MP. There is a consultation out, and if you go to the Disability Rights UK website, they've got a whole set of things that you can do and support for helping you do that. If you want, I guess there's a thing as well about, because the mainstream news is so shit on disability, like making sure that you're finding like better sources for that. The Canary is really good on disability. I think the majority of the journalists there are disabled. They do loads of really good coverage of it on it. There's the Disability News Service, which is a kind of news wire, which has loads of really good information on it. There's particular journalists who have written a lot about this, people like Frances Ryan or Natasha Hurst, who's the president of the NUJ. She's also done campaigns on that kind of stuff. So thinking about where you're getting your news and information from. And then you've also got Disabled People Against Cuts, which is a much more sort of protesty activist group. They did a big protest in London after the statement was announced, and they will be doing kind of more local. There's lots of local groups. So you could see if you are someone who is disabled and you're thinking about where you can get support, DPAC is, and where you can like find people to resist this stuff with, then looking for a local DPAC group is a really great place to start. And of course, if there isn't one in your area, they have lots of resources and stuff to help you set one up. So yeah, it's just like it's obviously it's really hard. It's like depressing, and it's nonsense as well, because a lot they keep setting it up as like there's too many people on PIP and we need to get them working. But loads of people use their PIP to work. Literally, it's because they've got a vehicle through PIP that they can go to a job. And then you've got this other thing, which is like with access to work, which is the government scheme that's supposed to support you when you get into a job if you have disabilities to help you do your job. Access to work currently has a year-long waiting list, like before you'll even get a call. So if you get a job and you're disabled and you need support, you won't get anything other than what your employer can offer you straight off for a year. So you're actively excluding people with disabilities from the workforce and then blaming them for it and then punishing them. So yeah, it's like total nonsense. Yeah, there's also Disability Rights UK are organising a mass lobby in Parliament on the 21st of May. So they've got details of that. So if you're based in London, or getting to London is an easy thing for you to do and you want to be involved in that, look on their website.
I really liked what you said there in terms of it being something that subjects itself to everyone. I remember someone giving me this like metaphor of like, imagine everyone had wings and you didn't, and and then they start to like see how this social model of disability really transforms depending on the existing predicates on which society is built. Which yeah, like has always spoken to me, because I think to myself, it's like I don't want to have to rely on medication to do a basic thing. I want the very structure and way we live to be transformed such that I don't need this supposed medication, because the way brains work are the ways brains are meant to work. And so if I'm having to medicate myself to then operate in a world like it's just so like anti-human, fundamentally like anti-human, anti-personhood.
No, I think those are interesting things, and we often talk about like within community. Everyone would have and find a role. I think that's always kind of been the case, and the ways that we are divergent actually always creates a stronger hold. Some people are able to stay home or stay in areas to look after kids, for instance, and some people are problem solvers or community builders. That some people wake early, some people wake late. And all of these are actually complementary. And we live in a system that is saying none of these are complementary. You're not supposed to complement each other. You're supposed to conform to a robotic, inhuman production machine. And anything other than that should be punished. And this is a great example of it. And really, as you say, we want a transformation of society so that these kinds of support aren't even necessary. But in the interim, then let's have that support, and whilst we're here. And also, again, these are, in terms of the national budget, they are negligible amounts of money, and they're not engaging with anything like a wealth tax or higher rates of tax for people who've got a lot of wealth, not higher earners, because actually, most people who've got money in this country don't have high paying jobs. They keep all their wealth offshore. They're not engaging with any of those things. They're saying instead, how can we, punish people, and we'll make it both a moral thing as well as a quote unquote balancing the books thing. And it's interesting, Rory Stewart, though, and I want to pose this to Debs, recently said, like, he's becoming more and more left wing, and that ultimately he's really disappointed with Labour because it seems to be austerity light. It's the same as the Conservatives and has no moral mission whatsoever, has nothing to get behind, which is the critique that most of us make. But then, of course, because he's still stuck in his old ways, and this is the critique I'd like, Debs, for you to slap down with due force, he says, what we have created through PIP is a perverse incentive system, because job seekers allowance, or the benefits you get if you're out of work, are not enough to live on. So lots of people who are just end up out of work, they try and work out a way of being on PIP because it's just about enough to live on. Which, to be fair to him, he says then suggests that you need to make that enough to live on rather than punishing disabled people. I think that would be generally the way forward. I mean, what do you think about that critique? Because that's what Labour's saying they're trying to do. They're trying to rebalance it with a very minor uplift of the amount of money that you'd get from job seekers by like trying to kick loads of people off PIP.
Well, I mean, obviously you're getting there to like, do you think that participation in our current economic system is just like a good thing in itself, given that most of the jobs that exist are, at least to some extent, bullshit. I mean, if we go back to David Graeber's book Bullshit Jobs, it's incredible where it's like even the jobs which are socially useful, like being a teacher, they will all say like a very high proportion of the thing that I actually do is bullshit. And I think that, going back to your point, actually one of the things about neurodivergence in that context is I think that neurodivergent people are just like, one of the things is less able to cope with the bullshit. It's like, actually, I can't make myself do it because it doesn't make sense. And so it's like it's a signal to the whole group. In fact, in terms of what you were saying, B, as well, it's like, yeah, there's something very useful about having people who, because of their autism, because of their ADHD, whatever, are like, no, let's not do this. Like, yeah, a form of resistance against this. And of course, like, it screws people over because you have to participate in this thing and you have to do the bullshit, or you will end up living in like awful poverty. And so then you have this system which is like, well, yeah, how can you learn to mask your traits? How can you learn to medicate yourself out of these things so that you can participate in the bullshit? But yeah, I suppose in terms of this, like, and I do want to say as well, even though I was kind of saying lots of people use their PIP to work, I'm not saying that is in itself makes them like morally good. Lots of people use their PIP also to volunteer, like, and even when you're not doing kind of formal volunteering, disabled people are often also the main carers of other disabled people. Like, there's a huge amount of value in people with disabilities just being able to live a regular life, just being able to move around, being able to have some self-determination over how they use their time. And yeah, I suppose I would come back to like arguments then around universal basic income and how are you providing a kind of basic floor for people to have autonomy over the way that they use their time, which actually would allow people to be entrepreneurial, to be creative, to look for genuine places of creating value, doing something of value with their time. Whereas if what you're trying to do is slot people into an overall broken, largely bullshit, like at best it's bullshit, right? Like, there's loads of things that people are having to participate in their jobs which are like actively harmful. Supermarkets are actively harming like our soil system, our food system. They're driving farmers into debt. They're like, obviously the cashier at the supermarket is not personally responsible for that, but like, you could imagine a much better way of doing this job than like creating profits for Tesco so that they can, yeah, like suck all the nutrients out of the soil. Like, yeah, I guess it's like, this is like this little extra piece of cruelty on top of an entire economic system. And this question of like, how much are you forcing people, like they're calling it motivating people to work, but really forcing people to participate in this system. It's like, well, maybe actually mass non-participation would be the most useful thing that we could do a lot of the time.
Absolutely. The thing that I'm thinking also is the fact that, like, as you said before, this is very much state violence in action, has been since the feudal period. So when it comes to our response, when it comes to how we start to rethink, transform, change our lives, like what does that actually also look like? How do we create systems of sustaining ourselves, of supporting ourselves, of surviving, and simultaneously existing in the world that we have present?
But it's going to be a whole big thing. You actually need to do that deep thinking and then test and play and do it together. Human beings love to play. Let's play with creating a better world on every level. There's two things I wanted to note. It is about food, right? And how food that you need if you're disabled sometimes costs more. That's because terrible food, which is often subsidized, is extremely poisonous, right? Like to us, right? And Britain, more than America, actually pioneered processed food, particularly during the war period. And this comes out of our own poverty. And it's like, well, okay, the poors in this country, we created white sliced bread, which is just sugar, right? Like, and people used to eat jam sandwiches. And people on average in Britain used to have 1,000 calories a day less than the Americans, right? Which is why they are taller than us. They have deeper voices. They have and we used to talk about them being rich Yanks, because because the elite of our country said they don't really deserve good food, right? Like, and if we can work out a way to make money off them and give them shite, We will, right? And in the aggregate, poisoning our food, poisoning our water, poisoning our air, right? All of those things create disability. In the aggregate, if you do that to 70 million people, you'll get tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands more people who are like disabled or sick in some way, chronically and for life. There's a lot of talk about how like microplastics in water affects us at a cellular level and creates long-term chronic conditions, right? Like a lot of research on that, and it's worth looking into. So if we're doing that to ourselves, we're not doing that to ourselves. If that is being done to us as a society, and then the same people who are doing that are saying, but we're unwilling to pay more in taxes to recompense anyone for all the harm that we're causing, I think that's an incredibly savage system, particularly when, and the thing I wanted to notice about like disabled people being like a contributor is in a park near me. It's a big, beautiful park. It's been redone up, and it was considered a hellhole. It was in a sort of red light district and had a very bad reputation. And now it's not only been beautifully done up, but it's maintained, and community gardens are created, and litter picking is done, and activities are put on largely by disabled people. Like disabled people are the heartbeat of the park, and they're there every day in the middle of the day doing things, making things that enriches the lives of the whole of the community, right? And that's happening across the board. That's just one example, of how people left to their own devices and given the ability to just live and contribute will contribute. They like people who I know the volunteers, they love it. And they're always thinking of new wonderful things to do for other people. The cruelty of this stuff is always very hard to get over in sound bites, but because it's very hard to explain to people how dehumanizing people and seeing them as others and numbers and drains on a system on us is really denying also the humanity of ourselves, which is actually, if we were given the freedom to exist in this system, wouldn't we be down the park making community gardens and contributing in the same way? And maybe we're not even seeing it because we're not allowed to be there during the day, because guess what, we have to perform, and we're taking that bitterness at that system and projecting it onto our fellow citizens and fellow oppressed people rather than the people who are doing it to us. And I think that's what's got to change, and that's the heart of this discussion that we lose when we talk about balancing budgets, and we'll lift up job seekers allowance, and like, what is it to be human? And if we take that forward, then we can start coming up with solutions, and it would start with cleaning up water and food and air, and building sustainable systems and all of those. And that would probably start with having public media where we can have these conversations.
That's like full circle moment.
I came up with that, pulled that one out of my arse.
You really did, man.
I'm having a Tom Chivers moment about like the Three Kingdoms.
The Three Kingdoms.
The final thing is just a massive shout out to DPAC, Disabled People Against Cuts. Oh man, since the beginning of austerity hit in, Disabled People Against Cuts have been the best, most creative, most active activists I've ever met in my life. They're dedicated, capable, exciting, kind, wonderful, right? Like, not speak highly enough about them. They are the best activist group in the UK, bar none. Right. And it's been an honor to spend any time with any of them and to support any work that they're doing. And if you get a chance, disabled or able-bodied or whatever, do support their work. It's important for all of us so much. And you'd be supporting some of the best people you'll ever meet.
It's also just like disabled people are not like, they're not different. They're not a different kind of people. They're like, you have chronic health issues. I have repetitive strain injury. You have ADHD. Like, these are things which are like, they're in us, they're around us, they affect us to different degrees. But we can all imagine very easily like a future where you're like, yeah, this thing gets much worse over the next 5 years. I would need this. Like, this isn't something which is, and in some ways I think sometimes the resentment and is that fear, right? It's the fear that that's going to become you. And like, yeah, I think a lot of the organizing and, that's where DPAC is so powerful, because it's kind of saying becoming this thing would not be this like awful outcome, right? Like, your life would be harder because of the way that society is set up, not because you would be like this terrible failure. And yeah, so I do think that like really centering and holding up the way that people that live with these like who are very chronically disabled by society, and yeah, showing their agency and their power is also a way of all of us being able to feel like disability is not this, or worsening disability is not this thing to be like so afraid of that you then like turn on those people or look at them with the kind of shame and disgust that you're actually feeling about yourself, and instead being like, that's the kind of person that I could be if that's what life brings to me.
Yeah, I was just about to say, Tom, we've not heard from you, but I don't know if you have anything to add to this conversation.
Well, no, and I think people have heard enough from me in this episode. No, I agree with everything that's been said here. Obviously, these cuts are like disgracefully cruel and punitive, and also like performatively cruel and punitive. It's not just that they're punishing the most disadvantaged people in society, but they are bragging about the fact they're doing it. And I think what stood out for me is like, where is the government going with all of this? What do they think is going to be the outcome? Because what are we seeing in like different spaces? We've got welfare support for the most vulnerable people in society being cut, work being made less valuable to do. Shit jobs and good jobs are less valuable overall because of inflation and the general state of the economy. But then, like, and the whole vibe is people need to get back into work. Labour is the party of work, not the party of workers, but the party of doing work. So people need to get back to work and do work because that's your sole purpose in life. Where is that work coming from under Labour? Well, nowhere, because all of the jobs they're trying to create are AI will do it, automation will do it, new technologies will do it, everything can be shipped. I mean, like, you know, the changes with migration and like migrant workers, particularly around like health and social care, where the government's just said, we don't want these workers anymore. And it's like, okay, so you're actively getting rid of people who want to work in a really vital sector. You're also making it more difficult for disabled people to live, and you're making it so that like any new jobs that are being created are being immediately swallowed up by AI or by like giant corporations. So where is this work coming from? Where is going to be this grand renaissance where like the British people who have finally stopped being shirkers and layabouts are suddenly going to discover a new valuable purpose in life and help recreate the economy, even on Labour's own terms? And like as we've been saying in this conversation, work is not you know you don't work to live, you live to work. You know, whatever way around that thing is, like you shouldn't have to work as part of your basic fundamental human being. It's something that should be like productive and valuable to society rather than the bare ability of you to have like a social and lived essence in your life. What does Labour want work to be? I know this is like a boring political discussion alongside like the real harm and destruction that disabled people and many other groups are going to face as a result of this government, but I just think like the government doesn't know what it's doing. It's just doing this because it's cruel and it likes to say it's being cruel to prove a point without it going anywhere. Like, no one's going to have real jobs after this. They're not taking PIP away from people so that they can go into more productive work, or they're not forcing people off of job seekers so that there's more valuable work to do in better industries. And then, you know, the point about, okay, well, if people are going in being forced into really shitty jobs because the welfare that they were able to rely on has disappeared, and then they're in shitty jobs and their health gets worse and they're less able to work and then there's less productivity. It's like just this eternal doom spiral of you've taken away the support that people need to live. They are not able to do productive and valuable jobs. They're getting worse and ill and have less money, taking more time off, less able to pay. It's just everything is going in a really, really bad direction. And it's just, I know that's a really bad way because I know we've got all of these organizations to support and fantastic movements, but what stands out to me in all these things I've been seeing in the news is like, where is any of this going? What is actually the way that they want ideas of work and the economy to be changed under Labour? And to me, it just seems like punishing the most vulnerable. And then there's like a ... And then and then things will be better with no real thought about how that happens.
I think it also creates a society that's just living in guilt and shame. You know, like how Gary Stevenson was talking about, like, you know, particularly this sort of...
You and Gary.
Hey, he's viral. I'm going to try and like reference him to get us viral. No, like, you know, there's this talk, and I see it a lot amongst sort of influencers for young men, you know, be an entrepreneur, go out and get yours, except you're not going to. It's a pyramid scheme. There's only so many people who can go and get theirs, right? And it's not you, mate, because, you know, your dad isn't super rich and owns 3 houses and, you know, private equity firm, right? So you're not getting yours. But what you can do is feel the guilt that you're not getting yours, because you keep getting told if you just keep doing all of these things, like wake up at 5 o'clock and do, you know, 200 reps and then like, you know, and read 12 books a day, right? You're going to get yours. And so there's these layers of guilt. And the same thing is like, oh, well, you know, what Tom's talking about there, it just, you know, hit me like a slab of bricks. It's like, I won't attribute this to malice. There's a level of underlying malice, but it's incompetence. It's a lack of imagination, vitality, capacity, capability, you know, from people in politics who have also underlying no moral mission, the outcome of which is a society that's guilt-ridden, on top of being like materially broke, we're also emotionally full of guilt and shame because none of us are achieving what we're supposed to be achieving. None of us are the productive citizens, according to them, that they would like us to be. And that's apparently all our fault and not in any way theirs.
But also, like, even under their own terms, their ideal of a model worker doesn't exist, could not exist in our current economy. Because the whole system is propped up on there are loads of people at the top who just make wealth from existing and owning stuff. And then there's everybody else underneath them who makes the wealth for those rich by doing horrible, worthless, bullshit, backbreaking, grinding jobs. You are either a massively exploited care worker or a shelf stacker at Tesco who's making money for somebody else off of your backbreaking labour, or you are ultra wealthy and you're skimming all the profits off of that from not doing anything yourself, from not providing any productive work, just from existing and owning stuff. So where is this ideal endpoint of these policies? I agree, it's incompetence, and it's just like this completely fantasist's idea of how to create an economy in which people work to produce things of value.
So I think
You
it's
know what your
pitchfork
problem is,
time.
Chivers? It's your attitude.
Yeah. Well, I've known that. I've known that for a long time, yeah. They call me the bad attitude boy in many spaces.
I want to be in those spaces.
And the
Shit,
thing that you
I
need
bet
to
you
do
would.
to address it, and that all of us need to do to have really strong health and a really great attitude to work, is to buy my supplements.
Yeah.
Which is how I'm going to get rich, by solving the ill health in work crisis.
And also stop talking Britain down. It's your neggy vibes that are making things worse. I mean, it's being revived now under Labour is like, oh, if only, the whole like stop talking Brexit down thing is like this vibes-based approach to how things get better, which is don't worry about your material conditions. Just think that things will get better because you're thinking it'll get better.
Labour reached out to loads of influencers recently, and Charlotte would be able to talk to this better because some of her friends were reached out to, and they were like, would you do some stuff for the Labour Party and for the government? They were like, fuck no.
That's a bad attitude. They should have had a better attitude there. They could have really helped revive the economy if they'd just done some free PR for the Labour Party on TikTok.
So I've seen, since that point, I've seen 2 or 3 fake podcasts pop up talking about government policy that are like boosterists. They're like, and what the great thing, people are talking this government down, but we have, passed more laws in the past 6 months than any other government. And I'm like, were they good laws? Like, but anyways, so check those out. Those will be on an airwave coming near you soon. Again, why we need to reform the media.
Now there's just this whole complex of like politically funded wrecker podcasts, which, would not be too difficult to spot. But I know that's where the real money's going. It's not going into productive work. It's going into boosterist podcasts.
Shit, maybe we should get on that.
Maybe.
I mean, they're probably all AI generated.
All those things I've said about Keir Starmer actually were lies. And,
they're not even employing real people.
yeah.
Yay. Okay, break time. Okay, and we're back.
Fucking hell, Saki.
All right, and we're back from the break. So, what is the future of the BBC, Tom?
Well, if you were to... Yeah, well, this is the case I have to make to you and to our dear listeners. If you are one of the dwindlingly small number of people still watching the BBC or reading the BBC, you will have seen recently they've started putting out some adverts that say, like, our BBC, our future, and they're these really sort of glossy, schmaltzy adverts with all your favourite stars and celebrities and TV actors all trying to get across this message that we all love the BBC, it belongs to us, so we should all take part in this really crappy tick box survey that the BBC has put out because they're trying to get lots of very positive, bland statistics about how much people love the BBC ahead of Charter Review, which is going to be this huge debate over the next 2 years about the BBC's Royal Charter. So what's the BBC's constitution? What's its purpose? How should it be funded? What is even its place and purpose in the modern media landscape? So there's now this whole like PR campaign of our BBC, our future, where the BBC is just trying to remind people that it exists and that Charter Review is coming up. So please give us some good vibes so we can fight against any government attempts to make us worse. But I think, behind this bland corporate PR exercise, there's this really crucial argument, or this kind of claim from the BBC that it's our BBC, that it's something that belongs to us, that it's part of like the national furniture, and therefore something we should all care really deeply about and feel like we have a stake in. But of course it isn't our BBC, because we don't really own the BBC. The way it's currently structured, the way it's organised, it isn't really owned by the public in a meaningful sense. Even though we're licence fee payers, or even though we're the general public, we don't have any power or control over what the BBC does. We are, at best, audiences, license fee payers, some may be, some may not be, and sometimes we're like really agitated complainers about what the BBC does, but none of us are active and direct participants in any of the decisions about how the BBC is governed, what kind of content it creates, its priorities or focuses in terms of what kind of news it produces, what kind of stories or topics it covers in its journalism as a large national news organisation that's supposed to be done in the public interest, or even, we don't have any role in broader decisions about what the place and purpose of the BBC is in the modern media landscape. Like Charter Review, all the previous Charter Reviews have been presented as like these big debates on the future of the BBC, but we, the public, have never had any role in them. It's been this organisation which is presented as public service broadcasting, owned by the public, operated for the public. We, the public, have no power over it. And that's been seen in so many different ways over the years. And, of course, everybody, in addition to having no power over the BBC, this kind of sense of public ownership, I think, makes people's criticisms and oppositions to the BBC even stronger. So whether it's its coverage on Gaza and its complete sort of failure to deal with that, whether it's capture by elite and corporate interests, cheerleading of austerity and illegal wars, its failure in the creative industries to represent the general public, it's a really, really highly criticised institution. So that's the kind of background to Charter Review and what's going on. But B, I can see
He's on his seat, the edge of his seat.
I think we've kind of covered in previous episodes, and we should reference that, the general argument of why you should care a little bit, and we should probably just reference that. Look, we have talked about like public media building our own institutions, how hard that would be,
Yeah, and this is kind of, in leading up to talking about the new report we've published, that is like the overarching thing of why I hope and really urge people to not care about the BBC, but care about this debate on the BBC. And the fact that it can be a space where we should be making these arguments about the role of public media and why it's important to not give up on the BBC, but don't give up on the idea that these institutions can be changed and can be changed to be far more democratic and working in the public interest.
So is that why we should care? Because they can be changed?
Partly, yeah. I mean, it is, as Debs was saying in one of our previous episodes, like the BBC is often seen as just like another media brand, but a particularly large media brand that has kind of connections with British national identity, with the public, because of all these claims about it being a public service broadcaster. There's rightly much more, what should we say, interest and antagonism towards what the BBC does because of that sense that it's something that belongs to us, even though, as I've said, it doesn't really. But the reason why we should care is that because public media as an institution, this idea that the media as a space of public discovery, learning about news, sharing culture, taking part in a kind of collective process of debate and understanding and learning about the world around us, the idea that there should be a public role in that rather than it all being run by giant commercial corporations and big tech is so essential to having a functioning, open and fair democracy. And Charter Review, aside from it being about the BBC as an institution, which many people dislike, and many people, rightly or wrongly, have given up on and think that it should be abolished entirely, Charter Review is basically going to be the last chance saloon for the concept of public media as this idea that there should be strong public protections in the media landscape and that the BBC as an institution is kind of the biggest representative of that. And so Charter Review is like an opportunity to try and reclaim that argument that public media matters. It's so important to our own rights as citizens to take part in a national conversation or to have news that's done in the public interest rather than just for profit, and trying to reclaim the BBC as this kind of central piece of public media is going to be so important going forward. So that's my opening argument of why you should care about Charter Review. Now here comes my argument about what I think we can do about Charter Review. So we at the Media Reform Coalition we wanted to ask that question, what could the BBC look like if we actually had real direct power and control over how it worked? What if instead of us being passive, bored, angry audiences who are compelled to pay the license fee or don't pay the license fee out of reasonable reticence and anger towards the BBC, what if we were active and direct participants in public media on the basis of our shared collective public stake in a public institution and in public media, and therefore had rights to control, direct, shape, take part in, collaborate in, be involved in the production, creation and governance of public media. So with that question in mind, we have just published a new report with the public ownership think tank Commonwealth called Our Mutual Friend, the BBC in the Digital Age. And we basically argue that as part of Charter Review, the BBC should be reformed as a mutual organisation. It should be mutualised. What is a mutual organisation? Well, it's an organisation that's owned and controlled by its members and run for the benefit of its members. So we have in the UK and around the world cooperative organisations, mutual banks, friendly societies, organisations where the workers or the customers or the people most directly affected by that organisation have a key role in deciding what that organisation does. And so we wanted to recast or propose that the BBC be transformed into a public service mutual, so an organisation that would genuinely belong to all of us by right. There'd be a defined right that the BBC is owned and controlled by its members, who would be all of the British public, and that constitution for the BBC would also guarantee for all of us as individuals and as a public defined powers and rights to participate directly and actively in what the BBC does. What would that look like in practice? Well, currently the way the BBC is run is at the top level, you have a load of political appointees who are appointed by prime ministers or by culture secretaries on the basis of like political friendship or trying to beat down on the BBC or just have their friends in charge. And from the bottom up, you have this whole sort of organization of highly commercialized, market regulated, aloof, elite commissioners and managers who basically try and create an organization that has a mass appeal without necessarily doing something in the public interest. For us as a mutual organization, we would want the public to have what we're kind of describing as top-down powers and bottom-up powers. So the top-down powers would be that the governance of the BBC would be directly controlled by the members. How would that work? So you would have, in our arguments, randomly selected panels from the British general public who would be appointed to be effectively the governors of the BBC. So you would have this, what we're calling members' council, as like the sovereign body of the BBC. So members of the public, members of the general public, randomly selected but sort of broadly representative of the British public, would have real power and authority to decide what is the BBC strategy? How well is the BBC board performing? Is it genuinely representing the public interest? How well is the BBC connected to its audiences? And how well is it as an organisation delivering on its public service mission? So immediately you would take power away from political appointees, unaccountable political processes, and actually put the general public in charge of how well is the BBC performing. That's the kind of top-down power. And in addition to that, we would have then sort of fed throughout the organisation additional panels of randomly selected members of the public who would be actively directed involved in setting the BBC's editorial strategy. So, for example, meeting regularly with BBC editors and saying, these are the issues we think the public wants to have covered. These are the big issues that are going on in society, and directly telling BBC editors, BBC journalists, people in charge of what the BBC does, this is what we think would be truly representative of the public interest. So immediately creating a much more direct connection between randomly selected members of the public, who we hope would be broadly representative of what people want to see and hear about in the news, and the people at the BBC who are in charge of creating it. So creating, first of all, this like top-level governance members' council within the BBC to put the general public at the top of how the BBC is governed and run. But then throughout the BBC's operations, still having direct input and participation from members of the general public to say, we want you to talk more about climate change. We want you to discuss we're interested in certain statistics about immigration or welfare, and directly telling BBC journalists from the horse's mouth, from the general public, this is the way we want you to address things. So that's sort of part one of our vision of mutualisation, is saying the role of members of the general public needs to be fed throughout how the BBC makes decisions, how BBC executives, managers, staff work, and making it a very collaborative experience, right? This isn't just kind of having a sort of parish council within the BBC that says, you must do this and we want it to happen. Actually, it's about sort of, what we would hope would be a really kind of collaborative, participatory exercise of members of the public becoming more informed and engaged about how a large media organisation works, telling that large media organisation, this is what we think is important or what we would want you to do, and that being a much more kind of reflexive way of running a public media organisation which is supposed to represent the needs and interests of the public, and putting that representation at the centre of the organisation. The second part, which is kind of the flip side of this, is that kind of top-down governance would, be randomly selected, right? So not everybody in the general public would be able to be part of these panels, because you can't have an organisation that's like sort of governed by 70 million people. But in exchange for that, what we would say is like, okay, well, you need to give bottom-up powers to members of the public. You need to have a way that every single individual in the UK can actually have a direct, tangible role in what the BBC does. So what we propose is, in addition to these kind of randomly selected representative public panels, that you also give every single member of the British public a defined right to choose what content is funded by the BBC. So every single member of the BBC would have a defined amount of money that every year they could say, I want to fund this particular project, or I want to give this money to this journalist to investigate this matter. And that immediately would be a huge transformation in the way we think, not just about public media, but media in general, which is to say, we should all have a direct democratic role in this large public institution in deciding what it does, what it investigates, what it produces, what it researches. And those sort of two sets of powers combined, we argue, would be transformative in the way that not just the BBC works, but the way we think about public media as an institution, as something that we have real ownership and accountability and power over, because of not just the fact that it's written in a piece of paper that we own the BBC, or that you get a bill for the license fee, so therefore you can access services, but actually your ownership and your control of this organization is a day-to-day experience, whether that's from the public's needs and interests being represented in these panels within the organization that tell BBC staff what the public is interested in and what it should do, but also giving you as an individual a power to shape what the BBC produces, to actually have your own slice, a real tangible monetary slice to say, this is the content I want funded, this is the way I want the BBC to go. So that's in broad strokes the kind of big outlines of what we're proposing. And there's many different elements and proposals of different bits and pieces of the BBC, but those kind of two powers, the top-down governance that's led by representative members of the public, and the bottom-up power of everybody to decide what the BBC commissions and what the BBC funds, we see as kind of the integral elements of turning the BBC into a mutual organisation that's owned and controlled by its members.
Fantastic. So what do we think about that, guys? What are our thoughts for this new proposed structure of the BBC? Debs?
I mean, as a general principle, obviously, I'm into it. And I do think there's something that's future facing about it, even though the BBC's brand is obviously quite old fashioned. But what's interesting is if you look in the US, where they don't have nearly the same kind of history of well-funded public media that we have here. This is creating something like the BBC is actually something that a lot of journalists are talking about or saying is necessary, or recognizing the lack of it is has quite a direct relationship with how bad things have got in terms of their political system. And even with sort of newer technologies, there's a book coming out, I think, shortly, by Karen Howe called Empire of AI. And I was listening to her chatting on some tech podcasts this week. And she's making this argument around AI as a neo-colonial force, it's going around the world and extracting all of these minerals and kind of acting this very colonial way. And then what she talks about as the alternative is democratized technologies. She's always saying it shouldn't just be this thing of there's these technical experts and then they create something and they put it out in the world and then they see how harmful it is. And then a bunch of social experts come along and are you've caused this harm, so how can we remedy it? Instead, actually, what if there was a more democratic, mutual way that people could be figuring out how to design the thing in the first place so that it was less harmful? And certainly when you're looking at a technology with the profound potential for harm like AI, that seems quite a logical thing to do. So yeah, I'd be really interested to know how these plans for the BBC are not just imagining the kind of content or the kind of platform or the kind of thing that the BBC is now, but how much this kind of participation could actually be baked into new forms of media, new kinds of platforms and products that the BBC could produce. For example, a social media network, for example, new AI tools. So yeah, I think I guess I'm interested when I was doing Tom's job, we always talked about a devolved and democratized BBC. So is this a devolved plan? Is this something that's just happening at the national scale? It just seems to me for buy-in, especially in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, there needs to be some recognition that people literally are living under different legal systems and that there are different cultures in different parts of the UK. And this is what Marcus Ryder always said. He used to be the head of news in in BBC Scotland. He was there during the referendum, and he was saying one of the problems with the BBC is that it's trying to have this sort of one-size-fits-all idea of where the political centre is, when actually the political centre is like really diverging in different parts of the UK. And I suppose interested as well in how to be more imaginative about this like process of participation, because classically when people do get to participate in things created by state bodies, what that really means is you go into a room and you eat some like dry sandwiches.
Yeah,
And
really
you
crap
listen to
biscuits and
some
lukewarm tea. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You like listen to some people talk on a stage, and then maybe you sit around a table and write some things on some post-it notes. I run these sessions all the time. Like I'm not to say shitting. Can I say shitting? I'm not shitting on like the classic processes of facilitation, but
Yeah.
they
They're
definitely
useful exercises, but they're not the be all and end all of what participation can truly be,
Well,
right?
they're also very much geared towards like white middle class people
Mhm.
who did well at school. It's like it's a very classroom environment.
Yeah.
It's just inherently exclusionary, and it also seems completely unnecessary in the context of like this is literally about creativity, and also that when we think about people participating, I know when we talked about this before, we talked about, well, and on other topics as well, we talked about this idea that we own it have of 21st century public services. So it's not, even with our water systems or our energy systems or whatever, we're not just saying we want this run by the state. We're saying we want people to be able to participate. The kinds of people that are going to be up for like being on the board of their local water system is like, it's a very particular slice of the population. I think you actually could imagine a wider group of people being up for participating in media, partly because we participate in media all day long. Actually, when this thing is designed in a way that is tapping into people's sense of fun and creativity and, you know, sharing memes and like, then actually it's something which people actually actively want to do. So yeah, I'm always interested in how we can like there's this thing of like describing the structures, but is there a way of evoking what the feeling could be of coming together with a group of people, and how it could not just be like a set of post-it notes, but maybe something kind of a bit cool.
Kind of a bit
No.
cool. Can the BBC do that? Can the BBC even do that?
Well, this is why I always said start with Channel 4. Channel 4 is so much
Mm.
more likely to be able to create a form of participation that people might actually enjoy than the BBC.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on both of the things you've raised there in terms of like devolution of power and control over broadcasting and making participation not just about like governance and decision making, but participation in media, participation in creative processes, they were, or they are, at the core of what we're kind of proposing here as like an institutional transformation of how we think about public media, and as the BBC as the largest public media body that we have. On devolution, I'm absolutely at the core of it. And this is kind of one of those bottom-up powers I'm talking about, where the BBC wouldn't still be this like monolithic national institution, but somewhere within the bowels of BBC headquarters, there'd be like governance bodies of, you know, juries of randomly selected members of the public. But actually, the BBC's resources as a local media outlet, so like a mutual BBC we'd see would have to be embedded in local communities so that members would like actually be able to participate in the production and creation and commissioning and sharing of media in the local areas. So we would see like a mutualised BBC as being partly a national media organisation with a huge budget for creating news and content, but also would be opening up community access to its local resources. That it would be this kind of partnering institution, this like anchor for civic institutions, for local councils, for libraries, for schools, hospitals, universities, basically as this kind of like hub and spoke approach where within every local area, within every region, there would be a BBC institution that would be directly open to public participation, to community control. And it would be devolved in a way of like, okay, well, BBC West Midlands wouldn't just be a radio station with a couple of underpaid journalists. It would be like a community centre where members of the community could come and say, I'm from the West Midlands. Partly, I want the BBC to report on this, but also, can I take part in making something for the BBC? Can I use my slice of BBC funding to create with my friends or with my business or with my community a piece of media that is directly sourced from and made by the community? So that's the kind of devolution angle. And then that still feeds into like, how do you make participation and involvement in media much more democratic, much more exciting, much more closely engaged with as you say, actual creative processes rather than just participation in putting your hands up and saying, who wants the license fee to go up or down? We are not just passive consumers, we're active participants. We can post stuff, we can share stuff, we can shout at one another, we can put videos online, we can make videos ourselves. But all of that process, it's been much more kind of liberatory in how we as individuals are able to engage in the media landscape. But all of those processes are oriented around, does it make money? Is it a viral hit? Does it get loads of people angry, or is it something that's like shareable or, memeable? Whereas actually, like, that process of direct participation in creating and sharing and being a part of a collective media experience should be a public and democratic process rather than a wholly commercial one.
And to recenter quality, to recenter good art, to
Yeah,
recenter
exactly.
immediately, like, it makes me think of the fact that like children would be able to like walk in and be like, I want to make a movie and
Yeah,
just
and
like
I think that's
do that.
Yeah, and I can't. That's the thing. A lot of surveys have come out in the last few years where it's like, oh, kids these days don't want to be astronauts and scientists anymore. They want to be TikTok influencers, and that's seen as like a really bad thing. And I always think that shows that kids like want to be. They feel that these new platforms and technologies allow them to express themselves, that they can be artistic and expressive and creative. It's just that all these platforms are shit and made for money and horrible, violent, misogynistic, harmful content. What if there were a public institution that took all of that energy and that individual creative expression and made it public and made it something that is just available to you by right as a child, as a citizen, as a pensioner, as a member of a local community, and said, here is this platform, a digital platform, a broadcast platform, a radio platform, an online platform, all of these different elements of what the BBC does. What if that was open to you? What if there were processes in place that allowed you to come in and say, I want to make a TikTok style short about something that's going on in my local community, and I want to have a platform so that it gets seen by people in my local community, rather than it's dependent on a horrible algorithm that prioritizes virability and shareability and memeability.
And it gives more incentive to like essentially connect people in practice, because it's like, oh, now I actually have to talk to people and tell them, go
Yeah.
watch this thing, go engage with this thing, go
And that's the
support
thing
this
that there have been, like, the BBC itself and other organisations have done, like Debs was saying, they've done these exercises where they get people in a room or they get people to make a media product. And at the start, everyone sort of says, oh, it's going to be too complex and it's not going to produce outcomes. And over the process, you learn that people getting together to do stuff is really productive and really exciting. And as soon as they get over that barrier of like a typical English thing of, why am I here? The tea's cold. The biscuits are crap. I just want to get home and collect my 50 quid for doing this, or whatever the kind of the inducement is to take part in these processes. Like, people like working together and they like producing things. And that should be something that's central to our own democratic participation in media, rather than being passive audiences or rather than being datafied subjects of a horrible, harmful social media landscape. Why does that have to belong to TikTok? Why does that have to belong to Facebook? Why can't that belong to us?
Why does it? What do you think, B? Why does it have to?
Well, I mean, and remember, by the way that the internet was talked about when it first began, and then that language was used by mega corporations like Facebook and so forth, which is that this is a democratic space where you can it's democratic and free. You have control over what you do, and you're free to do what you want, right? Which is actually the utopian world that many of us actually strive to create, right? And here it is. We're doing it first through an information system, a communication system of all these wires together.
The internet is a system of tubes, as Al Gore said.
Al Gore was a genius of communication, and obviously responsible for the internet, as him and so many other people like to claim, and not Tim Berners-Lee. Anyway.
And hundreds of thousands of like counterculture experimenters in online technology and, zines, like people turning zines into digital projects. That was like the 1980s and 1990s of the internet, was small communities of people using this technology as an open and free space to get together and do stuff.
Yeah. But the reality is the state never wants to enable those things, right? Like, that's not what the state wants to do. And ultimately, the BBC is a state institution. And I think in social democracies, and, Britain is clinging on with its fingernails to the idea that it might be a social democracy with like some, state institutions that act for the public good. In a social democracy, people get very mixed ideas about the state. They forget that you could take away the NHS and every other thing that does good for the public, and you still could have a state with just the army and the police. The state is really just the army and the police, and the rest are concessions that we won from the state begrudgingly. They didn't want to give us free healthcare at the point of use. They didn't want us to have the control over our own water, and ultimately they gave it to private corporations so they didn't have to be responsible to anyone for delivering a good service. And now, when it, like the case, for instance, for taking water back into public ownership has never been clearer, right? When they're literally polluting the thing we need to live and destroying all our coastlines and our rivers, and there's just poo in the water everywhere, right? They still refuse. And part of that is like the quote unquote belief that the market is the best solver of the problems, and because they've been bribed and they're co-opted by the financial elite. But part of it deep down comes from the fact that people in government don't want to have responsibility for things that the public need and want, because they don't want to have to deliver things that the public need and want, because they don't like the public. They don't see themselves as there to do things for the public. They're there to have control of power, and they want power. They don't want responsibility, and they don't want to have to do things, and they don't want to be beholden to the whims of the public, who might say, hey, could you get the poo out of the water? Like, oh, well, we have to sort this out. I don't know if you've ever seen panic on a person's face, like the minister who was sent up to Hull, was it, or Huddersfield, where the steelworks were being taken over, when they suddenly realized, oh, I've got to take this over, and I'm responsible for this. Like, and I don't know what I'm doing. And that's, of course, the other problem with the state, is we've drained all expertise from it. And the only people who want to be part of the state are kind of people who would like to avoid having to, change careers in their life or like learn new skills. Like, I mean, it becomes like this bureaucratic dead weight for people who have no ambition, no hope, no skill, no drive, and no interest in the world, right? Like, and these are all the critiques of the state. So, of course, then when you look at the BBC, which is a pseudo state institution, of course it didn't jump into that. Their position was always going to be, we provide for people what we think is best, and from a political elite who's not interested in listening to the public at any given point. Like, we really don't. We need some small number of the public to give us a rubber stamp every 10 years for whatever crap we're going to put together. Yeah. And as long as the BBC performs its role of backing the state and backing big business, then it's fine to really do whatever it likes. If by perchance it happens to make some nice programming that people like, then great. So that's why private enterprise came first. But actually, private enterprise didn't come first. Private enterprise came second. What came first, and this is relating to actually what we're seeing on the horizon right now, which is the potential devastation of universities in the country, is research institutions. Research institutions, by the way, created everything that is in your smartphone, right? Research institutions, i.e. universities, places of higher learning, places where people were encouraged to go and learn about the universe and think about the universe.
Yeah, and specifically public research institutions, right? Not sort of private bodies set up by the arms industry, but public research institutions that were just, what happened if we put these two things together? Oh, we've created nuclear power.
Yeah, and not just technology, but ideas. What if we put these two ideas together? Oh, we've created social anthropology. We've created like a study of human beings in society, right? Like, and those give us insights. And then we go, oh, well, we mix social anthropology with psychology with a set of tubes and the creative arts, and we get things that we all like, and it lifts us up. And then we have, a decade or so of freedom and equality and democracy, and then the corporations come in and screw it over. And then historically, if the state is acting in any way in the public interest, eventually, once private corporations have destroyed something to the point that it is unbearably oppressive, the state might come in and take it under control and make it that like little bit less oppressive, and react, for the benefits of people. And we might be getting there with social media. We might be getting to a point where there is a collective sort of doom spiral that we're all in, where we go, oh, actually, someone needs to come in and sort this out, and we all demand our politicians to do it. But honestly, unless we absolutely demand them at like almost gunpoint, they are not going to do anything about it, because they don't have a responsibility for sorting out this mess, because that's not why they got into politics. They got into politics to wear shitty suits and to feel really important in meetings. Like, they didn't really, like come in to solve problems largely.
I mean, there's a really interesting comparison there with like how the BBC was created, because if you go back and read all the historical documents, it was like this thing called radio had just been invented in like the 1910s and early 90s. And someone from the post office, as in the UK government department for how post and messages and telegraphs are sent, went over to America, and they discovered that their entire radio network was in absolute anarchy, because everybody could transmit whatever they wanted on any radio frequency whatsoever. It was just a jumble. Nobody could hear anything because everybody was fighting all over the same frequencies. And this post office guy came back to the UK and said, if we're going to make the use of this technology, it should probably be run in the public interest, or not just in the public interest, it should be run by the state. The state should have direct authority over who runs the frequencies, who puts out what. And that slowly but surely led to the creation of the BBC, which, yes, is and was then a state institution, but by sort of accident and force of will of the people who were in charge of the BBC at the time, this idea of public service broadcasting came out, that it shouldn't just be like owned and controlled by the state, but that it should be owned and controlled towards like public benefit, that it should do things that benefit the public. And that's sort of, people could use that argument today. Everything's overlapping. Nobody's getting any kind of clear signal one way or the other. It's completely captured by corporate interests who are just there to make money over whatever sliver they like. But then it's like, the two paths are either you just embolden the existing state institutions with more power over digital technologies, which is what we're seeing with things like the Online Safety Act or the Digital Markets Act, which is just to say, we've had enough of corporate excess, now we're going to come in and have some basic public regulations. But that still leaves a great deal of power in the hands of the state, because it's just when a government minister or when a regulator decides enough is enough, they step in and do something. The other path is, well, okay, we've got all of these technologies, and these technologies have at their core a individual participatory power, whereas we as individuals have power like never before to decide what's on our screens, what goes onto other people's screens, how we share and communicate with one another. So rather than the answer being, let's just give state and public institutions more power, it's let's take that power back for ourselves as individuals. I think with BBC Charter Review, we've actually got a relatively good bargaining chip. The challenge for the government and for people in charge of Charter Review is going to be, how can we get people to keep paying the license fee or whatever funding model comes next when people hate this organisation, when they do not feel that it has any role or relevance, or they don't have any control of it? How are you going to convince people to continue supporting and sustaining this organisation in which they have no stake? That's the sort of argument we're trying to build up around mutualisation as a radical form of reform for the BBC, is to say, if you, the state, want this organisation to continue, you've got to give away some of its powers. If you want the public to keep funding it, you've got to give the public something back in return. And that can't just be votes on the BBC chair. It's got to be real substantive powers that link in with the new technologies and the new participatory form of media we have.
Okay, so we've got to somehow communicate that to people, because I'm still, despite sort of a decade of being pulled on board with the BBC reform agenda, still ambivalent, because I still think it's a state institution. I still think that, organizations like, or protocols like Mastodon and so forth are ways of recapturing and redoing information sharing communication systems in a way that is bottom up, democratic and controlled, free, and that I want to see. So I want to, quiz you. I've got 7 questions and then an 8th one on process. And I want to quiz you as if you were like on, BBC Morning on Sunday,
All right, I have to put on my posh, polite presenter voice, do I?
You've also only got like a maximum of about 3.5 minutes to answer all the questions. In total, like you got 30 seconds a question before I go, that's all very good, but blah, 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 blah.
30 seconds? God, that's generous for a mainstream broadcast presenter. Wow.
I'm going to be generous to you, because remember, we don't want nuance, because that's not what we're about.
No, that's funny lines that can be repeated online.
Well, hopefully you can come up with a bit of that as well.
Of course.
So the first one, and this is the hardest one probably to answer, which is when you're talking about randomly selecting people to sit on juries to create stuff, and particularly to sit at the top of the organization, like, what are you going to do about expertise? Randomly selecting panels seems like we would not have the necessary expertise to run a multi-billion pound global media organization. That's pretty scary.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a mutual organization, right? This is all going to be done in collaboration with BBC staff, the experts who are there at, horrible term, at the coalface of producing public media, of interacting with all these different systems of production. This isn't just going to be, let's lock 30 random members of the public in a room and they come out like the College of Cardinals, white smoke comes out the chimney and they say this is what the BBC is going to be. It's an active ongoing process between these randomly selected bodies of members of the public and the people who are within the BBC creating public content. It's a collaboration and a partnership between the people who work at the BBC and the people who own and control it, the general public.
In the report, does it sort of outline how those collaborations would work?
No, because the longer report, we've got like the briefing, right, which is the sort of 8-page summary of this is what it could look like. But within the longer report, where we go into the deeper criticisms, the long-term structural and democratic crises at the BBC, we talk exactly about this thing of, well, it would work because you're like making a collaborative and participatory exercise. You aren't just creating another like top-level governance body that happens to be staffed by members of the public. You're creating a whole new set of relationships and participations between the audiences on whom the BBC's legitimacy rests and the people within the BBC who are making news or commissioning content or doing R&D at the BBC. It's about basically connecting what the BBC does, its workers, its staff, its executives, on a day-to-day level with what the public want and need from the BBC.
Okay, so how do you, in a democratically controlled institution, stop special interest groups, particularly those who we were talking about it last week, how the Socialist Workers' Party are fantastic at manipulating public meetings and public fora, those that caucus and that have very, strong organizational principles. How do you stop those, ruining the system of democratic participation?
For our randomly selected panels, we basically propose that these would be a constantly circulating body of representatives, right? So it wouldn't be that, like, for an entire charter period, you would have the same random 30 people in charge of the BBC, whereas actually every year you would bring in a new set of people. If it were 30 people, 25 of them each year would be replaced. 5 of them would stay on to kind of give like an institutional legacy, and people who continue to have knowledge of what happened last year would stay on the next year. And it would kind of be this constantly circulating process of like new voices, new perspectives, new ideas coming in charge of these randomly selected panels. That's one of what we hope is like a practical safeguard to being captured by special interests, is that it is always representative of the general public because it's just randomly selected, designed to be kind of demographically, regionally representative of the public while being picked at random. But it's also always new voices and new people.
Okay. So in it, you talk about the license fee is outdated and unfair. What's the replacement?
Yeah, I'd say we've been a little bit cheeky in the report. This isn't the answer I'd give live on air on the BBC Media Show, but we have been cheeky in the report in saying, like, we as the authors are ambivalent on what the next BBC funding model should be, but we are not ambivalent on the principles of why collective public funding in media is important and how that funding should be decided, how it should be set, how it should be democratically accountable to the BBC's members, i.e. the public, rather than just decided at the whim of politicians. So we set out in the report like the principles that the BBC's funding needs to be universal, that it's paid for by everybody because it benefits everybody, that it's independent, that it's not controlled by random government ministers or like corporate bodies or whatever. And also that it's like fair and representative in the way that the license fee isn't, that it's like understands that not everybody has the same means to pay. And in the same way that kind of council tax works, that it should be adjusted according to like, are people able to pay this full value or should it be discounted depending on people's circumstances? I have my own personal views on what I think the BBC's funding model should be, but really for mutualisation, for turning the BBC into a mutual organisation, there are lots of different models you could take. But because it would be, in order for it to be a universal mutual organisation that is owned and controlled by everybody, the funding would have to reflect that. We still think that people should pay for the BBC, that people should make a collective public contribution to a public media organisation. But that would come in exchange for guaranteed rights and powers in the way that the BBC and the licence fee doesn't currently provide.
Well, also talking about funding, if you're getting member-directed sort of budget allocation, doesn't this create like a few problems, like, short-termism? You're also talking about rotating the juries a lot, like instead of, and some of the creative process requires like consistent funding. Art sometimes, requires like that baseline support for artists, regardless of whether they're making something good now, they might make something good later, and you just kind of need to stick with them. What about fragmenting funding? What about ending up funding, for instance, loads of conspiracy theorists? Because there's lots of conspiracy theories. Like with this member-led budget allocation, how do you protect against those things?
This is partly I don't want to say a regulatory question, but like our proposal is like that it would be member funding for what we would call public purpose content right? So what you're trying to fund would have to be in some way tied to the public purposes that the BBC as an organisation exists to serve. So currently there are these 5 public purposes about what the BBC should do, and under its current really murky Byzantine commercial regulatory system, every single piece of BBC content has to prove in some way that it fulfills one of those public purposes, whether it's educating the public, informing people about news and current affairs, representing the diversity of the UK, and so on and so forth. We would say, for this mutualisation, that in giving members an individual slice of funding to allot to their content, it would have to be for public purpose content, because it would have to be something that would benefit the wider membership, right, or other people in their communities. So there would have to be some controls in saying, like, you can fund what you like, but the people who are pitching for that money, the people who are asking to be commissioned by this kind of open public funding, would have to prove in one way or another that they're fulfilling the public purposes. But then on top of that, the public purposes would be decided by representative members of the public, right? This wouldn't be something that's set by the government over a charter period. This is something which a representative body of the BBC's members would say, this is what we think the BBC's purposes should be. This is how we think the BBC proves that it is a public benefit, an organisation that benefits its members, because everything it does fulfills these purposes.
Well, I foresee a lot of documentaries being made about the royal family being lizard people. So,
I mean, if you could find, if okay, this is a democratic thing, right? If randomly selected juries of members of the general public,
by the way, I'm into it. Like, this is what I'm trying to say.
I mean, sure, you know, Louis Theroux chases the lizard people would be
I think it'd be a global hit. I think it'd be a global hit. But that brings me to my next question, which is then, like, you know, what about editorial standards? How do you maintain them in a democratic organisation, particularly when you're balancing diverse interests? Because when it's just beholden to a regulator and its own rules, it's a lot easier than having to deal with democratic diversity.
I guess so, but we've seen, like, you know, Ofcom as a supposedly independent regulator constantly gets itself in a twist over what is impartiality, what is balance. What does it mean when, I mean, the recent thing with GB News, where, like, there's supposed to be a rule in law that says politicians cannot present news programmes. But the way that Ofcom has interpreted that law has been so murky and mired that GB News can get away with it because they just took them to High Court and said, well, there's no real actual legal definition of news or politicians. So, of course, Nigel Farage can present news bulletins, right? That's a problem with kind of, you know, independent or statutory regulation. It's like, it is still mired in, like, highly bureaucratized and political processes. I think for, like, again, we're talking about collaboration, right? So I think in a mutual organisation, the way that the BBC would define balance and impartiality would partly be from, like, getting the views of members of the public within these panels and saying, what is it that you think we should be covering these debates? What is an accurate and appropriate way for covering debates on climate change or immigration? But still, like, giving independence and instinct to individual journalists and reporters within the BBC themselves. So it's not that we're creating, like, journalists as delegates who are basically told by a panel, this is how you must report stuff, and if you don't report it that way, then we're going to sack you. It's like a constant, ongoing, deliberative, collaborative process between people producing news at the BBC and these publicly representative panels to say, you know, journalists go out and investigate stuff. Well, I think there'll still probably be some kind of, like, you know, regulatory oversight with some kind of public accountability. But that's always in collaboration and conversation with the public, right? Is deciding what are our priorities? What is the best way we can represent this while still giving independence and free expression to the journalists themselves?
Well, I think if public conversation is still being created by the winds of big tech and the press barons and private finance, that is going to affect what the public body.
No, I agree. It's like, yeah, how, you know, because these randomly selected bodies of members of the public are not going to become, like, people operating in a vacuum, right? They are still going to be open to all of the harms and excesses and influences of the outside world, not just big tech, but, like, their own families and their own communities and their own biases and prejudices that they see. Our kind of core civilizing, humanizing claim at the heart of this is, like, people can have power and responsibility to make their own decisions. And if they're brought together as a democratic body to decide those things together as part of what a large public institution does, the outcome over time, and it might take a while, and it will have hiccups, but over time it becomes, like, representative and democratic. Because if you're, you know, the BBC pats itself on the back and says, well, we recently interviewed some members of the public and they said some of them liked our coverage, some of them didn't. And that proves we're accountable to the public. What we're proposing with mutualisation is, like, this ongoing, persistent process of asking the public, getting the public to participate in what the BBC does, but giving it longevity so that it's always ongoing, giving it accountability so that the public can see what are these decisions being made, what impact do they have, and giving it power. Like actually saying to members of the public, if you think as a collective body that the BBC isn't doing something right, you would have the power as owners and controllers of the BBC to do something about it and change the way the BBC works. That long-term change in thinking about what the BBC is, how it's controlled, how it relates to us as citizens is big and difficult. But if we don't think about the BBC in these terms, if we don't try and do something different, then we're sort of surrendering ourselves to be fucked over by big tech anyway. This might be our last chance. This could be the last gambit of holding on to public media. And if we don't kind of make the case for something that's radically different and more democratic, more participatory, but high-minded and positive and based in a humanizing and civilizing ideal of what individual members of the public can do when given power and collective responsibility, that's something we've got to try and chase.
I also think this is why the devolution piece is actually really important. Because when I've imagined it as more like there are parallel processes happening in different parts of the UK. Yeah. And then, if you might be in a part of the UK where you're like, the people in my region, we're not really on the same wavelength. I don't really like the stuff that they're choosing to create. But actually, I really like what they're creating on the Scottish BBC. And that's what I'm going to watch.
It's like the ITV franchises, right? When it was originally a commercial network, it was like, well, you had all these different regional corporations that were the ITV network. And people would come to recognise the idents of particular commercial broadcasters because, like, Granada always makes really good stuff, or Carlton or Tyne Tees does stuff. That was a commercial model, but it was a devolved commercial model. It was companies within regions with direct connection to the people and communities in those regions producing media content for those communities. That's something we've completely lost.
Did we go through all 7 questions?
Yeah, I kind of like the thing I wanted to leave.
Those weren't 30 seconds.
I know those were not 30 seconds. So, Tom, I mean, what I will reflect is clearly you put together a huge document with a big, bold vision, but communicating that and taking that forward is going to be like actually something interesting that we can talk about on the podcast is like, how do you take a big, bold vision that is incredibly detailed, that has these high-minded concepts that you're talking about and get them to people and get people motivated and organized, not only to get people, sort of broadly in agreement with it, but then also some of them organized enough to actually pressure for this. And I think we should follow that process on the podcast and check in with actually that element, because I think that would be interesting. But I also think that like the comms has to be worked on, because I think there needs to be case studies. I think you need to, when you're talking about like we can create things together, you need to be able to immediately reference 1, 2, 3 things that people create together. I think the same with social media and stuff like that. Like you're so enthusiastic and you put in so much that you can't like not give the whole answer. And I do it.
Well, my answer to that is like,
that's not an answer, that's a reflection.
No, I know, but my reflection on that, and actually a challenge to you guys, or a very positive challenge to you and Got News Club listeners, is it's not just that I want to report back the process to you guys. I want you guys to be a part of the process, right? Actually working out together, how would these ideas work? Are they ideas that we could support? If they're ideas that we could support, how do we communicate them? I am not a communicator, right? I'm an academic who rants about stuff. I'm not a public relations professional. I can occasionally come up with a pearl of wisdom and I can sit back and I can go, that sounded really cool. And then no one was listening to it.
That's what you do. By the way, everyone, that's what Tom does. Like once or twice a week, he just gets to sit back and go, yeah, that was really cool.
Yeah.
And
this random reference to the Three Kingdoms period of China might be the coolest thing I've ever said. But no, that's my this is and coming back to like the start of this discussion about why I hope people care not about the BBC but about public media, because it is this space that we can have control of, and that should be important to us and central to our own sense of self and democratic expression and civic participation in this dogshit country. And it's like, if we want to change it, if we want to reform it, what are those ideas? How do we get people excited about them? How do you get someone like me away from the microphone? Or at least give me something exciting to say that isn't like a very...
So B.
Like, mate, stop using Latinate words all the time, like...
I haven't used Latin at all today. I've avoided French entirely.
You've used participation about 1 million times, like, and I, and it's just like, doing stuff together doesn't have to sound like participation sounds like a sort of bureaucratic process rather than doing things together, making things. Honestly, I swear to God, we're going to have to get in the lab and work on that. But I want to hear it from the audience. And I want to say this: some of the audience I know they're working on community democracy, citizens' assemblies, making things happen. I think they need to grab this as an opportunity to make citizens' assemblies be writ large, be a universal, like a living thing for everyone in the country. And they're able to do that at a scale that you can't do on the local community through this wonderful institution. So I think that's what people should take from the BBC Our Mutual Friend report, which I encourage you to check out on Common Space, is
Commonwealth.
Go and check that out and then think, okay, how can we make the arguments we're making every day at our local level to this thing, to make this thing work for us, for all of us, because it's all there, it's in there. Boy, it's a beastly thing.
But also, my final thing on this is
can you have a final thing? You can't spend 3 months in the lab making a thing and have a final thing, can you, man?
This is my final thing for News Club audiences is, in addition to, please go and read the report, or at least read the briefing, which is 8 pages. We've tried to write it in an interesting and snappy way. Read it, but if you fucking hate it, or if there's a part in that you think that's kind of interesting, but I'd do it differently, tell me. Right? Because I think so many of these reports are published with really high-minded ideas. Most of them come from the MRC or organization we worked for. And I know that the sort of general response to them is people will go, oh, okay, that's a new idea. I kind of don't like it. I do like it, whatever. But then these things just kind of die, right? They sit there and they gather dust and they get dormant. And then in 10 years' time, when that institution or that body fucks up again, someone like me goes, well, actually, 10 years ago, I told you we could have done this. And it's because, people are just sort of rightly feel that these aren't spaces in which we could have power to change and reform stuff. But I want to make the case that this will be, could be, should be an opportunity to do that. And this piece is getting people starting to talk about that. So tell me if you fucking hate it. Tell me if you like it. Yeah. Let's go from here.
We're giving you an excuse to be shitty bastards. So, please take it with both hands and run with it.
All right. Before we leave, I would just like to point out that we're doing a new little thing in another episode, which you can also find on the Got News podcast, which is a more specific Q&A answering the questions of different people doing cool stuff out there in the world to help direct their thoughts, their actions, whatever that is. So if you have a question, if you are doing any form of organizing, existing in community, or just being a person with a thought, then reach out, let us know, and you never know, maybe it's your question that gets answered. Don't forget to read the report. We will share it, we will link it. It will be in the newsletter. You can sign up and join the newsletter and get more regular updates about the news and Chiver's fantastic writing. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you soon. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.